welcome to another episode of the Discomfort-Zone podcast.
The idea to cross the ape man with the Anunnaki. Slaves, work animals, created for one person, to unburden the gods.
Hello everyone and welcome to yet another new episode of the Discomfort Zone podcast. It's a pleasure to be here as always. Thank you for joining me, Crimson Clad Patient Zero and Rondon. Great to be here. I think everything is running and set up and all looking good, so I'm glad to get started. I'm gonna try and remember to drink a bit more during the episode, because a few past episodes I noticed my throat gets very dry, and I sometimes never mind. It annoys me to listen to it, so I hope it's not too much for you, but I'll try and keep it a bit clearer. Okay, I might be hearing a bit of an echo. Is the sound okay? Just let me know if you hear anything that isn't off, that's off. But other than that, I think we are good to go. And as usual, we have a pretty full episode. We'll see what we get to. And as I was going through the subject for today, I sort of, I'll see how we go, because there's a lot to start off with, and we're going to start off with Edgar Cayce, whom I believe I mentioned in the end of the last episode. And then based on how deep we will go into that, we'll see how much time we have left for the other things. But I did want to say that I know I say this in most episodes, but specifically this one, because it's a pretty broad subject. We're going to be talking about clairvoyance, premonition, prophecy, etc. And if you have any questions, if you have any direction that you'd like the subject to go into, by all means do let me know through the chat, and we can stay on the subject for as long as possible. And if we've spoken about it before, quite a little bit, not too much, but if you feel ready to move on, then we can press on. Okay, but for now, let's start at the beginning with this very, very interesting character by the name of Edgar Cayce. Now, I really only heard of Edgar Cayce from Drunvalo's book. And then he never actually wrote a complete book from my knowledge. What we have is a collection of his, trances, and those have been put into chronological order or put into different subjects, and different people have edited different works. So I've read a few of those. They're worth the read. It's a bit scattered. It's not very. It's not narrative at all, which makes sense because that's where it came from. So, before we get any further, who was Edgar Cayce and what do we want with him? Well, he's a very special human being, and I think the most, from what I know, the most special thing about him is that he is the clearest, most empirical, provable, scientifically verified case of a clairvoyant that I've been aware of in history. Obviously, in ancient times, there wasn't the same rigorous scientific, verification as there is today, and it was much less on record. But Edgar Cayce was born in 1877, so the beginning of the 20th century, that sort of crossover. And by then, there was a very loud and strong community, especially in the medical profession, who were trying to keep everyone safe, as there were certainly a lot of rather crude medical practices not long before that. So Edgar Cayce was living in this time in a small place, and he developed these very unique abilities. Now, according to him, he actually went to the forest as a young boy, and he saw a lady, an angel, whatever you want to call it, and this female figure said to him that they could help him if he wanted to, if he could have anything in the world. What would he ask for? And he said he wanted to help humanity, to help people. And it was some sort of from that moment on that he started to develop his very unique abilities. Yes, that's true, Patient Zero. They weren't fluoridating the water, they weren't poisoning the air or the food, or much simpler times in a way. But in terms of Edgar Cayce, his abilities, for those who have never heard of him, he would go into a trance, which he would actually go to sleep and go into this trance state, a hypnotic state. And in that hypnotic state, he would, in his words, he would be taken over. His body would be taken over by this alternate being, and they would speak through his body, through his mouth. And this is a rather familiar, famous method for certain clairvoyants. There's different ways. There's people who write, so they sit down and they sort of, I don't know exactly, but they channel this being who can then write through usually their left hand and usually their not dominant hand. And the idea, this more common method is where you really go into a trance-like state, and often the voice can change, the inflections can change, and since it can be, I think, or sort of has become a rather expressive mode, you can see certain people who are channeling, or at least claiming to be channeling, who get into a very odd trance-like state of moving around or dancing or having strange voices or strange sounds. Now, personally, I feel that a lot of the song and dance that goes with them is often, in my experience, not really the case. The people who I've heard of, seen, who are very convincing, both with the information they provide and with the way they are portraying it, seem to really be in a trance-like state, much like when someone is under hypnosis. And this definitely was the case with Edgar Cayce. He would lie and he would speak, and during his trance state, the information that he would give was very much obviously different from his own, and sometimes even contradictory. Edgar Cayce was a devout Christian. He was raised Christian, and only later in life he became exposed to these subjects, what we'll call metaphysics, through his own channelings, because as he's doing the channelings, he's not consciously aware, and he doesn't remember it afterwards. So there really is a clear disassociation between his personality, being, consciousness, and this state that he's in, at least according to his words. But it's very convincing, because there's a few cases where, for example, he speaks about reincarnation, and as he is under a trance, he speaks about reincarnation. The person who is with him writes down what he's saying, and then afterwards he tells Edgar Cayce what he said. And Edgar Cayce disagrees with him and says that it's not possible, and that there is no such thing as reincarnation. So that's a very odd behavior to exhibit if it's not true. It is very much indicative, in my mind, of someone who is faced with a truth that their personal identity, their personal, consciousness isn't aware of. And as he became more and more exposed to these truths, he was obviously later on convinced of them and would go on to change. So we'll talk a little bit maybe about his path that he took, as it were, when he was starting out. And so the biggest area that Edgar Cayce is both famous for and indeed did most of his work with was with diagnoses. And so from a very young age, he began having these diagnoses while he was under, and he began actually with curing himself. When he was afflicted as a child, he would go into this trance-like state, and he would tell his family how to prepare the cure from the different ingredients, and they would prepare it for him and give it to him, and eventually he was cured with this. And he had a few afflictions in his life. He lost his voice to laryngitis as well, and that was actually the one of the catalysts for him taking this whole thing more seriously. So in the beginning of his life, as a lot of people with these shall we say metaphysical capabilities, he didn't understand exactly what it was, and he was much more a victim to it than in any way sort of controlling it or using it. And he indeed dismissed it, both as either being untrue or not being as important. And it was only later in life, when he had this affliction where he actually lost his voice for a long period of time. I can't remember if it was actually for years, but for an extended period of time, and he couldn't work because of it. And he eventually met someone who suggested he tried to cure him, and he put him under hypnosis. And Edgar Cayce couldn't get to the third level of the hypnosis, the deepest level, where he sort of gives the therapist somewhat the liberty to do more. And since he wouldn't enter this stage, he couldn't enter this stage. The therapist couldn't help him, but under the lesser hypnotic state, he could actually enter into his trance. And it was at this time that he started to once again sort of offer the cure for himself, and eventually he got his voice back this way. And so once he'd cured himself for the second time, he became more convinced that this was something that was not only, worthwhile, and indeed he had many people around him, and they always seemed much more enthusiastic about his abilities and about the work that he could do with them than he was. Edgar Cayce, until the end of his life, never really got rich or tried to take financial advantage of his abilities. He offered all of his diagnoses for free, and the majority of his diagnoses he was doing actually from afar. And so people would send him letters describing their... they wouldn't describe his ailments. They would give him the name and the address, and he would go into a trance state, and then he would he would tell what the cure was, and then they would send them the letter back, and lots of people spoke about the success, so much so that he actually became very, very famous. So during this whole time, obviously the world in general is going through a lot of changes, and the debate both about metaphysics and science and medicine was very lively at that time. And though many of us might not remember, or not know indeed... Oh, welcome, sorry, All Indigo, Lax and Alien Honey. Thank you very much for joining. I don't always catch the chat, but it's a pleasure to have you here. We're talking about Edgar Cayce. And in this time, the late 1800s, beginning of the 20th century, the turn of the century, there was a very strong movement of metaphysics, shall we call it, of spirituality. People like Madame Blavatsky, who was at a time the leader of the great the Golden Dawn Society, the anthroposophist, what was his name? Rudolf Steiner was obviously one of the more famous members, who eventually left. But all of these big characters and famous, psychics and different people with abilities. Edgar Cayce certainly one of the more prominent and indeed more accepted by the establishment than most. But still, he comes in this era, this time where there is a lot of this discussion going around. And within that, Edgar Cayce, it's just interesting to see his specific story. And if you haven't heard of him or are interested, I really recommend just reading about him as a figure. There's a lot written about him, and he's very, very interesting. Because when you compare most, I think, of these stories of people with special abilities, whoever they are, and I don't want to insult anyone, but there are many, many figures and names that are around of people who can do incredible things. I find it very, very hard to think of someone who is as famous. So obviously there are people who, go and shut themselves off in a cave, but being that famous, interacting with people who adore you and, really worship you, and at the same time declining so much financial gain that he really was in rather difficult times in terms of his monetary system for a lot of his life. And there are very few people I can think of who were both tremendously gifted, almost, without question, and at the same time were really so humble and so intent on only doing good and not doing anything that could be construed or be turned into harming people, such as Edgar Cayce. So he's a very interesting character, I feel. And within Edgar Cayce's story, we'll talk a little bit more. You guys, let me know in chat. Do you want to hear more about Edgar Cayce, Or should we move on to some of the juicy stuff like the pole shifts and levels of consciousness? Let me know what you think. But just one more thing that I want to say about Edgar Cayce. He touches on a lot of different subjects. And so obviously the most famous one and what he was doing most of his life were these diagnoses where both his understanding of anatomy and his ability to produce these cures that seemed in a way not contradictory but just very different from the method that medicine was practicing at the time. It really was a small part of all of his abilities put together. And so within Edgar Cayce's readings, at a certain time he went on to actually have sort of philosophical discussions. He had a philosopher who was interested in metaphysics come and not interview him but talk to him and ask him questions and trying to get in. There are many books. Obviously his diagnoses aren't as interesting to read, but most of the books are focused on what Edgar Cayce talked about within those discussions and the subjects that he mentioned and expanded on. And so in fact this is really part of the reason that we're talking about him now. Drunvalo Melchizedek introduces Edgar Cayce in a tiny paragraph to begin with, where he talks about the fact that in one of the discussions, Edgar Cayce suddenly stopped what he was talking about and said, something along the lines of, that the poles are going to shift soon. And the interviewer said, what? And Edgar Cayce starts elaborating and talking about all of this huge both geological process and the spiritual effect that it will have, and we'll talk about that more later. And that's all Drunvalo mentions. And then he carries on to talk about the pole shifts. But indeed, with Edgar Cayce, a lot of his, not writings again, but his books and the writings about him are very much built up in these ways, because he would talk about many different subjects, very dense and not in a very linear, as it were, coherent way. And so we'll touch on a few of the subjects which are important, and in fact we've actually touched on some of them before, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to go into it. And I think we'll go until like 11:30 and then 10:30 where you are, UTC, and then we'll carry on to the rest of the rest of the episode. I thought of levels of consciousness. The rest of the episode. So, Patient Zero, you've mentioned Akashic Records. Akashic Records is something that I also hadn't... it is a famous concept, but I hadn't heard about it anywhere, long after I delved into a lot of these spiritual, metaphysical subjects. And it is a concept that struck a chord with me immediately, because it sounded so logical and sensible. So what are the Akashic Records? For those listening who have no idea what I'm talking about. The Akashic Records are the idea that everything that happens in the universe leaves a mark. That is to say, there is some form of a memory of it, hence the term records. Now, these are not sort of big books that are written in, as some of the Judeo-Christian, theological concepts might allude to, but I think the best way to think about it would be in very much the same way that our brains function. And I just had a discussion about this recently with a friend of mine. We sort of forget, or we experience life in both a linear fashion, that means going only forward in time, always, coming from the past in the present to the future. And we are very much bound by our memory, which means that our identity and therefore our interpretation of the world, and indeed almost everything that relates to our reality is affected by our memories. And this is something that we've talked about a little bit when we talked about the brain. What's very interesting about this is that we mold those memories, we shape them, and we even change them over time, and we do that sort of in reaction to who we are and how we relate to the world, etc. But I'm always amazed by how skewed and how just wrong my memory can be at times of certain things that happened far, far in the past when I remembered it a certain way very specifically, and that was just a made-up memory. And so we live in this sort of, fantasy world which is made up of our emotions coloring the memories that we have of who we are and what we've done. And that's fine. That's the way we are, and it's absolutely acceptable. But we forget that underneath all of that, there is actually our subconscious, which obviously our conscious mind doesn't have a, direct controlled access to. But our subconscious is not like our conscious memory at all. In fact, it's a very different kind of memory. It records everything emphatically, as it were, absolutely, with no mistake. And so our subconscious is not even remembering, it's recording everything that has happened to us in our life from start to finish. Now, one of the easiest ways to verify this is obviously with hypnosis, which a lot of these ideas, the theories that all of our memories were stored in our subconscious, was very difficult to verify. But once hypnosis came along, people were recalling memories that were clearly not in their conscious ability, things that from either when they were very, very young and even going back before. So there is this twofold, and we shouldn't really confuse the two. The conscious memory, which is a device that our ego, our consciousness uses in order to survive, among other things. But it's that same survival mechanism which is constantly making decisions based on our emotional system of what's important, what's not important, and what's important we remember, and what's unimportant, for whatever reason, we won't remember as well. Excuse me. Whereas our subconscious is not deciding anything. It's completely automatic. It records, quote unquote, everything that happens. And I believe personally the reason for this is actually much deeper than that. And this relates to the Akashic records, and we can approach that subject through the subject of water. Now, this might be a little bit out there, but hey, you've been listening so far, so it certainly won't be the most out there thing that we talk about. But if you have never heard, there was a Japanese scientist called, oh my gosh, was it Yashimoto? I might be confusing that. But if you look up water experiments and water memory, you'll be able to find it. It's very easy. It's very famous. Now, in those experiments, among other things, he showed that water seems to have what he called a memory, which means that on the molecular level, the molecular structure of water, when water interacts with different elements, it actually changes the molecular structure. Masaru Emoto, thank you very much. I've completely butchered that. Yes, and to call it memory, I think we should be thinking more of something like the computer memory rather than our memories, both because of the way it's created and the way it's governed. The water isn't deciding what to remember based on whatever. The water is being affected by its environment, and that effect, let's say unlike other things like stone, has a lasting effect. That impact from the environment actually physically changes the structure, and from that therefore the function of the water. Yeah, it's an amazing subject. Eileen Honey, what documentary did you watch? Because I'm not sure if I've seen it, but there's a lot about it. It's very, very interesting. So what does that have to do with the brain and the Akashic records? Again, we see that there is something about certain structures, specifically what we might call data structures, structures that can store information, whether that information be neurons or DNA or molecular structure. Those are all information. There seems to be a method which is the physical impact, as it were, of the environment on the system. And this physical impact leaves a lasting effect that actually changes its structure. Okay? Now, we want to take that very sort of physical thought, that physical paradigm, and try and place that on our universe in general. So what do we mean by that? the whole universe, or whatever we call it, reality, existence, is obviously happening at a certain point of time, but there is the past. And if we look at the position of the stars, we see that where they are, based on where they are now, we can calculate what happened before. It's a bit similar in that sense to what is going on with the Akashic records. Our universe, which is existing in a certain way, is affecting, quote unquote, whatever we want to call it, the environment. So when we're talking about the Akashic records, we're talking about a level of reality, a dimension that is apart from the physical level of the universe. And that's why it's the environment, as it were, quote unquote, surrounding the physical universe. When the physical universe is happening, everything that happens in it, from the smallest atom, is leaving a dent, is leaving a mark on that environment, as it were. And this is, a way to think about how the Akashic records work. It's not that there is a book with lots of people writing in it. It's that when an event takes place in reality, and we can connect this all the way to our personal behavior, whatever action I take, I am A, affecting the whole universe, and B, the effect that I'm doing is going to be everlasting. It will ripple out through time. Now, obviously, most of the things that we do aren't big enough, important enough for our consciousness, our memory, the part of our brain that sort of sees patterns, to pick up on it. It will be a very, very small ripple. But nonetheless, the smallest of ripples is still making that indentation on reality, just the way that our subconscious is still recording every tiny, minute, little detail that happens. Okay? Oh, Snecky, welcome very much. Thank you for joining. Even 24 minutes, not a problem. We're glad to have you now, and you got just in time for the second half. Be water, absolutely. I love Bruce Lee. He's interesting. So, yes, and don't forget, we are 70% water. So, already on the way. Okay, so we've spoken a little bit about Edgar Cayce. Now, I'll be honest, he talks about reincarnation, and he talks about a lot of these mystical ideas, but I think we're going to stop at that point right now. And before we move on, I actually have one quote that I would like to share with you here. So I'm just going to put it up. Okay, I'm going to put it up in chat, and I'll read it out so the people listening can hear. And it's a quote from Cayce. And what the reason I felt the need to bring this is that there seems to be some underlying thread underneath all of Edgar Cayce's life and all of his readings, and it's a thread that is very difficult for me to imagine that this one person from that young age managed to, walk this line all the way until a grand picture arose. It's another sign, I think, that he was a very special individual that seemed to be exposed in one way or another to some very deep information and knowledge. And towards the end of his life, or in his later life, I should say, he certainly turned from offering these diagnoses, which seemed to be on a one-to-one basis of one person at a time, and turned more towards spiritual teachings. And this is a thought, I think, that at least I've had when it talks about, whenever I've read about psychics or people with special abilities or people who can see auras the way he could, or all of these different very, superhero enticing abilities that I think people could easily devote their lives to try and achieve. I like to remember this quote, which is from his Altered State. I'm beginning mid-sentence. Cayce relayed to this group that the purpose of life is not to become psychic, but to become a more spiritually aware and loving person. Sorry, I don't know why. Study group number 1 was told that they could bring light to a waiting world, and that these lessons would still be studied 100 years into the future. So never mind the study group and whatever that, but that sentiment of when we think about the Anunnaki, when we think about our aura, the ability that we have to change the world, how important meditation, blah, 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 all of these things need to be minimized in comparison to literally being a good person, a kind person, an empathetic person, to try to develop the love inside of ourselves. And all of these, very, very cliche and very, very boring things when it comes to, comparing it to psychics or people levitating or changing water into wine. Those boring things are actually the most crucial part of all of this journey. So I just wanted to talk about that because it's something that I think for me and perhaps for many people who are first exposed to these subjects can be very alluring, to think, okay, so if I now practice this meditation, the Merkaba, can I fly around, that is the very much wrong intention that we're going into with this. And in fact, that leads us very nicely into our next subject. So, okay, I'm going to try and get through this. I think we can. We'll see how it goes. But if you have any questions in chat, let me know. So, the next subject that Drunvalo mentions, as I said, was the actual poles shifting. Now, in the previous episode, we talked about the astrological importance of the precession of the equinox and how it affects us both as a species and at an individual conscious level. And indeed, Cayce spoke about this subject as well, perhaps in less clearly defined scientific terms. But what he brought to the table was indeed this subject of the poles shifting. And what do we mean by that? Well, we've spoken before about the magnetic poles of the universe, and I hope by now we have some appreciation of just how important a role they play in human life and indeed in Earth, all the life on Earth. Now, it's funny that we really don't pay that much attention to the magnetic poles, which from what I've seen, and I'm definitely no expert, and I certainly am not up to date, but they do seem to be behaving very, very shall I say, differently today, as a lot of Earth's behavior seems to be. But if you're interested in the subject, you can go and check out. It's obviously open information, the magnetic sphere around the Earth and the shape and frequency of it. But Edgar Cayce is talking about the poles shifting. And what he means by that is that, in his words, there is a cycle on Earth. And this cycle, as many other cycles that we've spoken about, talks about the magnetic poles literally shifting. That doesn't mean moving physically from the bottom to the top, but that the polarity of the Earth's magnetic field changes from, the negative becomes the positive and vice versa. And, Lax, yeah, your dad, he thinks it's an instantaneous snap. So the way that Drunvalo mentions, and I will just say that I'm not 100% convinced about this part, but as we're talking about the book, I will give first Drunvalo's statement. It is a very fast, it can be a very fast experience. I don't think instantaneous, but he was talking about something more like, 2 or 3 days, and the whole shift will be over. Sorry, my throat is really drying up. Just one moment. Okay, so yes, I'm glad you've heard about this. It's a pretty big subject, especially now. But don't forget that Edgar Cayce was speaking about this in 1920 something, I believe, 23. And so he was obviously in a trance when he talked about this, but he talked about it as being, on the one hand, sort of this crucial event that needs to be mentioned, but he sort of mentioned it halfway in talking about something else, and then he carried on with a different subject. And the reason for this is that what he wanted to say was that this was going to happen, but at the same time that there's nothing to fear. It's not in any way a dangerous or a catastrophic event. In fact, all indigo, as you said, many people think that's going to happen in the apocalypse. The actual interesting fact, the actual definition of the word apocalypse is revelation. And indeed, there will be, according to them, a revelation, both of information, of a lot of things, but it will, in Drunvalo's words, it's not in any way cataclysmic. It's not a dangerous event. It's a natural cycle that happens, but it does obviously affect our consciousness on a very deep level. Yes, yeah. This is actually scientific. So the rate that it changes as, the scientific community is rather adamant that the change is very, very slowly, that it takes sort of thousands of years for the whole change to happen, etc., etc. But it's definitely something that does happen. And again, interesting that this wasn't known about before Cayce, so he was predicting it, and later the scientific community came to verify what he said, and this was something that happened very, very often. No, yeah, I am not saying what's true or what's false, what's information, misinformation. I am just giving my opinion, and everyone is entitled to do their own research. It's a huge subject, and we're not going to be talking about, when it will happen, what will happen when it does, etc., etc. We're going to be talking about the grand scale of things. What is the theme? What is the procession, the process that's happening, and what does it have to do with us? So we've obviously spoken about the magnetic poles quite a lot before, and so I hope that we all know by now that the poles are very much connected to our consciousness, to our emotional state, and indeed to our psychic, ethereal states. And what this means is that when this shift happens, or as it happens, humanity on a global scale is actually going to be going through a change and through a process. And when Drunvalo mentions it, he actually says that this is very much something that is part of human memory. Now again, not the memory that we consciously hold, but the memory that we hold as a species. We'll get into that more in a minute. Drunvalo says that this process, this event, is something that we've been through before, and when we go through it, we will actually remember, and it will become clearer to us, and we'll once again be aware that we know what's happening and what's going on. Now, this process that he talks about, the pole shifts, is another occurrence of some patterns that we've seen before, including the revolving around the void. And so there is this pattern that seems to be in reality where you go through a void as the end or the death of one cycle, and at the other side there is a rebirth or a continuation or a new life. This, in his words, in Edgar Cayce's, in Drunvalo's words, this is what happens when we're born, and when we're dead, our soul goes through a void into this body, the physical experience, and when we leave, we go through a void to get out. It's the same void as we mentioned, it's not the same void, it's the same pattern, a different void of what we spoke about last week, where the precession of the equinox shows that we're going through this cycle towards and away the center of the of our galaxy, and within this cycle we go through this void, as it were, this darker period of human evolution, of human consciousness, and then come out the other side more evolved than we were. And again, we spoke about this with the musical instruments as the voids being those sort of half tones in between the octaves, and the same with the chakra system. So once again, the poles shifting is another instance of humanity's consciousness going through a void to be coming out the other side with a new realization, a higher point in that endless spiral. And what do we actually mean by that? What is this void, and what are the changes that come to our human consciousness? So for this, I have to say that I'm maybe I should say this, but I'm very pleased that we've spoken about these subjects until now, because now that we're going into the thick of it, everything starts coming together. I hope. You let me know in chat. But we're going to be meshing more and more of these subjects together into a cohesive storyline. So now we come to the subject of harmonies. And we've spoken about harmonies before, about the law of harmonies and how they exist on all different levels, in all different examples and expressions of them. And once again, we're going to be talking about harmonies, and this time we're going to be talking about what Drunvalo calls different levels of human consciousness. And in his terms, on Earth, on planet Earth, there are 5 different levels, 5 different possible levels of human consciousness. Now, I don't think they're actually names that he lists for them, but they are, a procession, a linear procession. Sorry, I think I'm saying the word procession a lot more than I used to since last episode. So what are these levels about? And more importantly, where are we? Well, let's, for the sake of ease, call them, 1 through 5, 1 being the first and 5 the last. These different levels, according to Drunvalo, exhibit different physical manifestations as well. And one of those differences is in the DNA structure and the number of pairs of chromosomes that we have relates to each of these levels of consciousness, according to Drunvalo. And the other is size, or specifically height. And so at the first level of consciousness, according to him, the people are around 4 to, more or less 6 foot, which I actually didn't look up the differences. I don't know what that is in meters, but it's around 1.5 meters to 2 meters, I believe. Something like that. Probably you can check it out. Yes. Sorry. And the 5th level of consciousness is somewhere around 50 feet, 50 or 60 feet. Now, that number, I think, for most people should raise some alarms. It's definitely a rather large human being, even if we consider the, dimensions that we think of the Anunnaki, etc. But, as we've heard mentioned a few times, and we haven't actually gone into it in detail, but the talk that we have of giants, and indeed the giant skeletons that seem to have been found in different places, would certainly be explained if we consider the fact that these levels of consciousness are also related to the physical body. Now, for us and for our discussion, we're actually going to focus only on the first, second, and third levels for now. The 4th and 5th are sort of further down the line. We'll see if we get to them. But for now, with the 18 minutes, okay, that should be okay. With the 18 minutes that we've got left, we're going to talk a little bit about those different levels of consciousness and what they mean. So, the first level, I should say, this relates very much to the numbers from sacred geometry. If you remember, long ago, I think one of the first episodes of this series, we spoke about numbers in sacred geometry and the meaning behind them. 1, 2, and 3, unity, binary division, and trinity, sort of the cohesion, the change, something new. It seems that this is the same pattern that we see with the levels of consciousness. And so, according to Drunvalo, the first level of consciousness is a level of unity. And this means a lot of different things that we'll get into. But as we can all imagine, it's that the level of consciousness where there is not yet a separation between individuals. Now, if we wanted to relate it to human development on an individual level, we could relate this to what Freud was talking about with a baby's ego, a baby's perception. And I can't remember the term, I do apologize, but there is this level where the baby doesn't yet distinguish itself from the rest of the world, meaning its identity is the entirety of the world, which is exactly what we said, unity. It means that when I think of boundaries, the boundaries don't end with my body. My consciousness myself is actually more expansive than just this physical body. Now, with a baby, this is because the brain hasn't yet developed all of the parameters to distinguish, to tell what part of the body it can control, where the borders end. All of this comes from interaction. When you bang your head into the wall, you know that your head ends there and you feel it. Whereas, when you throw a stone on the floor, you don't feel it. For a baby, this is obviously a very unaware level. Certain people in spiritual states, and I think specifically in psychedelic states, I haven't heard this, no, I have heard it actually in spiritual, but more often with psychedelic experiences, some people describe exactly that feeling of an expansion of their being far, far beyond their body to encapsulate, to stretch across the entirety of the universe. And in fact, Dennis McKenna, Terence McKenna's brother, had a similar experience in his youth. And so this description, once again, of this expansion is simply the passage from viewing myself as a single body with the definite borders to viewing myself as simply a natural extension to the environment surrounding me. And in fact, there's a wonderful TED Talk, if you haven't seen, by Julie, I can't remember her name, and it's called A Stroke of Genius. I think it's called A Stroke of Genius, Stroke of Insight. And she had a brain aneurysm that nearly killed her, but was killing off her left hemisphere. And as it was doing that, as her right hemisphere took over, she felt that the borders that distinguished her bodies were melting away, and she would become part of the wall that she was leaning against. So I want to try and give that perspective, to not think of it as just being this like godly, bigger than anything sensation of absolutely everything, but it's a way of viewing the world. It literally could be, we call it a level of consciousness. It's a prism that we can view through, whereby in the same way that I see my left hand and my right hand, and I could, as it were, distinguish them, they are obviously part of the same mechanism, and it would be ridiculous to think of them working against each other. Well, we can view the world in the same way. I'm not saying that it's the best choice, but as a possible prism, when I view other, human beings as part of this same grander design, greater system, then I can see myself not just as the individual, here talking to you, but actually as part of a much, much larger thing that wasn't born with me and won't die with me. So this is the kind of perception, the kind of consciousness that I'm talking about when I'm talking about the level 1 of consciousness that Drunvalo mentions. Patient Zero, wonderful. Yes, my stroke of insight. If you haven't watched it, it's like, 17 minutes. Give it a watch. It's amazing. And she inadvertently, I think, covers a lot of these subjects that we talk about here. Amazing TED Talk. So, if that's the first level, what's the second level? Well, as we know, the second level is separation, is division. This is exactly the opposite of what we just talked about. Imagine starting off as viewing, let's take it personally, as viewing my own body, as a unified being where everything is working together, and then suddenly getting a disease. And, we could take it from the very physical, of feeling that part of my body is betraying me, of feeling that this organ isn't functioning the way that it's supposed to. But often we will still feel that it's sort of part of my body. But if we look at something like multiple personalities, we can see that they have a perception of themselves, which, although we call them one person and we see they're in one body, they are perceiving reality through two completely separated prisms, consciousnesses, two different people inhabiting the same body. And this can sort of give us some good metaphor for what we mean when we say the second level of consciousness is division. It's taking something that can be seen as one, as whole, and categorizing it, dividing it, making it into different parts that are disconnected from each other, or at least appear to be disconnected. So what is the meaning of all that, and what does it have to do with us? Well, according to Drunvalo, the first level of consciousness was really what we would call the tribal level of consciousness. Now, I don't want to be offensive in any way, and I'm not going to be talking about any kind of, not even sociological or racial, things, but let's keep it on a very theoretical basis. When we think of a tribe, we usually think of a people who are much more connected with their environment than, let's say, modern-day industrialized society. And indeed, I think even today, when you examine people who are living so close to nature with so little, defenses, as it were, they experience reality as much more a connected one being. The weather, the earth, the wind, the animals, everything is affecting them and each other. So it's much, much easier for them to experience reality as an interconnected web of life that they are simply part of. And so if we imagine that first level of consciousness is a unity that was always there. So from the moment of birth, from the first experience of this life, that unity is never challenged, as it were. The second level of consciousness is a step forward, because in here we are now dividing and categorizing. We're seeing things in different ways. Now, the biggest problem with the second level of consciousness is that it's a tremendously volatile and chaotic level. Drunvalo mentions it as being a stepping stone, meaning it's a necessary step that you have to take. There is no way to avoid this level of consciousness, but when you are in this level of consciousness, you are most likely to destroy yourself. And therefore, it's very important to get in and out as quickly as possible. And once you get out, as it were, in his words, we reach the third level of consciousness. And on the third level of consciousness, we have this synergy, we have this reintegration. We shouldn't confuse it with the first level of absolute unity that was never challenged. If we want to liken it to an individual again, we can see the first level as an unaware baby. As we said, he didn't make the choice to view the world this way. This was always the way he viewed it. That person, that baby, grows into an adult who has an individuated experience, an experience of themselves as separated from the world. And let's say that person developed a spiritual practice, a spiritual affiliation of some kind, which allowed them to see the world as a unity once more. That second unity, that second view of the world, the prism, is different from that first unity because it comes after the integration, after the unification of the two separated halves. And the unification, the process of bringing these two separated halves together, is what brings change and innovation into reality, into that level of consciousness. So once again, okay, I feel like we went through that last part. Let me just go over it once more in case it was a bit quick. We have the first level of unity where we cannot imagine being separate from the universe. The second level is a necessary level that we have to go through. It's a level where we start categorizing. We start not understanding, but perceiving the world in a different way. And it's that separation which allows us to then reintegrate into a, as it were, stronger or more wholesome, more complete unity that has been changed by the experiences of the second level of consciousness. And so what Drunvalo is trying to say here, and this was, 20 years ago, more actually by now, 40 years ago, is that the level of consciousness that humanity is in general right now is that second level of consciousness. That level of separation where we don't see that poisoning the oceans is killing us, that we don't see that, killing innocent people elsewhere will come back to haunt us. We see everything as separation, and everything is sort of mine versus the other. Now that point is necessary. It's a level of consciousness that all beings that travel through this process of evolution have to go through, but it has to be remembered to be a stepping stone. And if you don't step off the stepping stone in time, you can actually, fall and crash and burn. And there have been instances in history when species have managed to, destroy themselves in that second level of consciousness, because it's the easiest place to do it, as it were, that point where you forget the unity. But if we manage to push through and we manage to remember the fact that this, reality, this experience, everything that we see is actually one process that's happening with different parts in it, And then we can have both of those perspectives at the same time. We can see the level of unity, that everything is working together, just like we do with our body. And yet we can at the same time distinguish and categorize different parts and say, my left hand is different from my right hand. And if they work together, then I can do more than if I could do with just one. So that was pretty much what I wanted to get over today with Drunvalo. I think in our, modern, very perplexing situation that humanity has found itself recently, it could be easily mistaken for some kind of catastrophic, chaotic, sort of, we've crossed the threshold, it's too late to change, things have gone so off the rails that it's impossible for us to ever get back on. According to Drunvalo, and I certainly do feel the same way, that isn't the case. We're actually right on track. We're doing exactly what we had to do because there was no other way to get here. And now is the time, as we see with the worldview of unity becoming so much more prevalent today than it ever was in history in the last few thousands of years, we see that humanity seems to be gearing towards great changes that have started to come already, and we can assume will continue to come into the future. Okay, that was a bit of a mouthful. Let me know in chat. Oh, Frankie, thank you. Let me know in chat for the. Oh, but yeah. If you have any questions, if I went over anything too quickly, but that was more or less actually what I wanted to get over today. So I'm glad we managed to do that. Okay. Yeah, so if you haven't heard of both Jill Bolt, why do I call her Julie? Jill Bolt Taylor, and her TED Talk, My Stroke of Insight, give it a watch. And it's just very interesting because she talks very much about this. And if you remember with the brain, she talks about the two hemispheres. And you see in action the huge difference in perspective between these two hemispheres. So it's like the, right hemisphere is the first level of consciousness. The left hemisphere is the second level of consciousness. So again, the right hemisphere, the creative, the subconscious, sees everything as unity, doesn't differentiate. The left hemisphere, rational thinking, sees categorizations, divides the world into different parts. And the third level of consciousness comes from the unification of these two hemispheres, not just in their synergy and the synchronous nature of the two hemispheres, but in fact in a very spiritual level at balancing and integrating the two personalities, as it were, the two parts of ourselves. Okay, excellent. So we've got, oh wow, a minute and a half left. I don't know if you're joking, Justin Ashby. Don't know, Justin Ashby. Sorry, but I will assume you're not if you're here. But yeah, pseudoscience definitely. Okay, before we go, I have to remember. Do we have a show after this rondon? Let me know in the chat. And I would like to thank all of you people who have joined. Agroed, thank you very much for joining. And Normok, great to see you back here again. Tripod, wonderful to have you as well. I don't think I remember seeing you in here, so if not, thank you very much once again for joining. Okay, is there a show? Oh, thank you very much. Yes, Post Up is next. Excellent. Starting in 1 minute, so make sure you stay on for that. And Crimson Clad, are you on afterwards, I hope? Yeah, I think so. So let me know. Okay, that's it for me. I've been Olev. Thank you very, very much for joining me. And I will see you all next week, I hope. Have a good one.